This Saturday at noon Eastern Time, we have a top 5 Big Ten football matchup on our hands that I am so excited to talk about. Between the 5th-ranked, undefeated, 7-0 in Big Ten Conference play Indiana Hoosiers and the 2nd-ranked, 9-1, 6-1 in Big Ten Conference play Ohio State Buckeyes. An undefeated Indiana team facing an Ohio State team who is battle-tested and whose one loss is on the road by 1 point to the number 1 team in the country in the Oregon Ducks. This game will be streamed on Fox and, of course, is taking place in Ohio Stadium, the Horseshoe, in Columbus, Ohio. The Buckeyes opened this week as 11.5-point favorites, and the line since has climbed up all the way to 13.5. So Ohio State is favored by nearly 2 touchdowns here, and this was the exact same spread as Georgia versus TCU in the 2022 National Championship game, and I get the feeling that a lot of people believe that this will be a similar type of dominant blowout for the favorite team, and we'll talk about whether I think that's the case and whether the data backs that up or not. But Ohio State's favored to win big here. They're given a 73.3% chance to win this game by FPI. They're viewed as better in the power ratings. Obviously, they're the more talented team by recruiting rankings. Indiana, though, has been impressive in their own right, winning 10 games in the regular season for the first time in school history, 10 games overall, even including previous postseason achievements. This is the first Indiana team ever to win 10 games. So a massive game for both programs, for both coaches, for both rosters. The last time these two teams met, Ohio State bludgeoned Indiana, even with some of their own issues at quarterback and offensive line. But this Indiana team is radically different, almost completely different than last year's team. Ohio State's team is more of the same, just with more veterancy, more experience, and better coaches. So we're going to talk about this game, and I'm going to give you my prediction and analysis for this matchup. But before we do so, I encourage you to help us score a touchdown on the channel, to help us drive down the field and do some things for me. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'd appreciate that a lot, along with clicking the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new content here. Like the video to give us a boost in the algorithm. Share this video around. Comment your own preview and prediction for this game down in the comments section below. Tell me why you believe Indiana or Ohio State will win this game. Join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. And also, this is the extra point. This is point number 7. You already did your responsibility and got into the end zone. If you want to go the extra mile, no pressure. You can sign up as a paid member on our Patreon page via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. You can purchase merchandise. We have a white or black College Football with Sam themed t-shirt, or we have College Football with Sam t-shirts that are colored in with all 18 Big Ten colors. So 18 different t-shirts for 18 different teams. And there's other merchandise at your, I don't know what the word, I'm blanking here, but there's other merchandise for you to explore there on the merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I encourage you to check that out if you want to make a purchase to support the channel, or you can send a super chat down in the comments section. But let's get to this game right here and go over the broad statistics, look at the big picture, and then, as we always do, dive into the details later. Indiana is viewed by power ratings as anywhere from a top 15 team to a top 10, in some cases even a top 5 team. They are one of the best teams in all of college football and one of the best teams in the Big Ten Conference. They're viewed as 17.7 points better than the average college football team per FPI, 20.1 points above average compared to, or according to S&P Plus, and 22.7 points better or above average per potential power ratings, which is my own power ratings. Ohio State is viewed as 25.3 points above average per FPI, 30 points above the average college football team per S&P Plus, and 26.2 points above the average college football team per potential power. Both of these teams are high-functioning machines. They are both wagons and in their own way. Ohio State is a collection of talented players, NFL players, and they have a ton of alien and freak athletes at different positions, like Caleb Downs at safety, Lathan Ransom at safety has been playing like an alien this year. A number 2 safety per Pro Football Focus probably is an argument to be number 1. Jeremiah Smith, I think, is the wide receiver in the country with the most upside, could be the nation's number 1 receiver. I would lean toward that right now. You have Quinshawn Judkins and Travion Henderson at running back, and Will Howard has been playing out of his mind at quarterback. As for Indiana, and I'm not going to forget about Emeka Egbuka either, but we'll talk about the players more here in a few minutes. Indiana doesn't necessarily have a ton of alien players, but they are the most fundamentally sound team in college football, and they are tough in the trenches. They have the Big Ten's currently most productive rushing defense, if you believe that, which is hard for me to believe, but hey, we're here. This is a world where Indiana may have the best defensive line in the entire Big Ten, and again, we'll talk about that in a few seconds. But both of these teams are in a high tier of college football. They are in the upper echelon, and I believe both are not just top 10 teams. I think Indiana is a top 5 team as well. You look at the points per play margin and the expected points added margin for both of these teams, and you'd also have the takeaway that Indiana and Ohio State are both in a similar tier of dominance. Ohio State ahead with a 0.414 points per play margin. That means for every one play Ohio State runs compared to every one play that their opponent runs, they score 0.414 more points. For Indiana, it's the same thing. They score 0.374 more points per one of their plays compared to one of their opponent's plays. And Ohio State's played the tougher schedule, so once you factor in strength of schedule, Ohio State's superior points per play margin is that more impressive. But Indiana functioning at that high level of points per play margin this late in the season, regardless of schedule, is impressive because Ohio State in 2022 and Michigan in 2022 were both in the upper 0.3 zone of points per play margin, and Indiana's right there. So they've been a very dominant team, and they game control their opponents to death. They can strike fast. They can drive slow. They run a multiple offense, much like Ohio State does, where they can come out in different formations and they can attack you in different ways, and they have depth. And their defense is good, so that helps the points per play margin and dominance too. Indiana's a 0.233 EPA margin, expected points added margin. Ohio State is a 0.299 expected points added margin. That just means where are you on the field? How are you driving? What's your field position? Because expected points added is all about where are you on the field, and consequentially, how much points are you expected to score. So both of these defenses do a good job of preventing their opponents from getting into plus territory, from getting in the red zone, the end zone, or close to the end zone, forcing them to kick some field goals or go for it on fourth down and failing. And offensively, they're very good at driving down the field and scoring in the red zone. Both of these teams are top 5 in offensive touchdowns per game. And then finally, the real difference here between these two teams is honestly strength of schedule. Indiana's played the 106th toughest strength of schedule. Ohio State's played the 28th. That's really a difference of maybe 1 or 2 teams adding on to Indiana's schedule to make it tougher to compare to Ohio State's. So if Indiana played at Penn State or played at Oregon, their strength of schedule would be very close to Ohio State's. It is, in truth, a difference of maybe 1 game that separates these strength of schedules. Ohio State's still more battle-tested, but strength of schedule, as we've seen before, is not everything. It can be an indicator. It can correlate with a team getting smacked in the face, but that doesn't mean it's a direct causation. Indiana's 5th in game control. They're 8th in efficiency, 2 metrics from ESPN that basically tell you who are the best teams in the country. Ohio State, though, is 2nd in game control and 1st in efficiency. So both of these teams are certainly near elite. Ohio State, per analytics, is elite relative to this season. We'll see if Indiana is elite relative to this season or not, I think, on Saturday. The key matchup here that I want to brief you all on is the trenches. Previously, I've talked about, well, maybe it's, the rushing offense of one team compared to the rushing defense of one team, or the passing defense versus the passing offense. Maybe the quarterback's involved in the run game, or maybe he isn't. Maybe we look more at tight ends than we do at other teams when looking at matchups. Here, it's O-line, D-line, linebacker. That is going to determine the game. O-line, D-line, and linebacker. Ohio State does have an edge built in because of how these rosters are built and how they've performed in wide receiver versus defensive back. but it's not as big of an edge as I think many people think. Indiana's done a very good job at defending the pass, at forcing opponents to make mistakes and intercepting them. They are one of the most efficient defenses in preventing their opponents from converting on fourth down. And Ohio State, while they have an advantage on the perimeter, their offensive tackles against Michael Kamara of Indiana, against Indiana's pass rush, that could be a matchup advantage for Indiana as well. And that could negate some of the advantages that Ohio State has through the air. And also, may I remind you that Ohio State's corners have had some problems covering wide receivers from any schools they faced. In Indiana, as we'll talk about in a few minutes here, they have the best wide receiver room that Ohio State has faced since they played Oregon. So there's a lot of different matchups outside of the trenches, but at the end of the day, trench play does determine a lot. It's not the end of the world because, again, you have that edge for Ohio State through the air. Ohio State, I think, is similar QB play. Ohio State has some of the best wide receivers in the country. I think they have the best wide receiver room in the country, especially with Tez Johnson sadly being hurt at Oregon. Hopefully he's healthy and he can come back soon. It's the same thing with any players who are injured for Indiana or for Ohio State. They've suffered some injuries on the offensive line. But at the end of the day, it is going to be trench play. It is going to be the rushing offenses and the rushing defenses here. And let's talk about those very briefly. Indiana, right now, is second in both opponent rushing yards per game, allowing 78.9, and opponent rushing yards per attempt, allowing 2.7. That's factoring out their game against Western Illinois as well. That's factoring out FCS games because TeamRankings.com doesn't like to use those games. And they only allow 5.8 opponent rushing first downs per game, 8th. Ohio State allows 5.4 rushing first downs per game, which is 4th. They allow 95.8 rushing yards per game, which is 5th. And they allow 3 yards per carry, which is 8th. Those numbers are not sack adjusted, and since Indiana and Ohio State both have over 30 sacks, there is a little bit of deceptiveness there. These rushing defenses are not necessarily invincible at stopping the run, but Indiana has held Michigan State and Michigan to season lows in rushing offense. Ohio State played Michigan State. Michigan State was able to run on the Buckeyes a little bit. Ohio State hasn't played Michigan yet. It's a matchup where, Ohio State is probably going to win. We can talk about that next week when the game is finally here. But Indiana, even when adjusting for opponent, there is an argument they have a better rushing defense. College football nerds straight up said that both of these teams are top 10 in stopping the run when you look at relative performance, so how they perform against teams that other teams have played, and doing a bunch of cross-examinations, which if you just do one cross-examination, that's transitive property. If you do a bunch of cross-examinations and you don't stop until you've reached the finish line, well, that's really good analysis right there. And Ohio State's first in that. Indiana's still top 10. And maybe after this game, we could look back and say Indiana had the better rushing defense. It's something that I did not expect to say, or ever, from a preseason standpoint especially, and even just a few months ago. But Indiana's defense has stepped up in the month of October and in early November. You look at rushing offense. Indiana is 59th in rushing yards per game, averaging 160.9. Ohio State's 37th, averaging 185.1. Indiana averages 4.4 yards per carry, 59th. Ohio State averages 5.3. That's 19th. So Indiana's rushing offense, I liken it to Michigan's of last year. There's little to no explosivity, but they consistently get 3 to 4 yards per carry. They can keep defenses honest. They can work the clock. And with how often they like to go for it on fourth down, Indiana this season is a very aggressive team, extremely aggressive. Not only are they good at stopping opponents on fourth down, they only allow opponents to complete 25% of their fourth down conversion attempts, and opponents on an average basis go for it about 3 times per game against Indiana, 3.1 times, which is just, it's insane. Teams love to be aggressive in Indiana, and they fail at it. You look at Indiana, they convert only 56.25% of their fourth downs, which is 52nd. They go for it on about 2 attempts per game, 8.1 or 1.8 to be exact. 71st. Ohio State's 48th in that category, going for it about 2 times per game on fourth down. Not necessarily in the top of the country, but when you are as effective on offense as they are, and in addition to that, you go for it on fourth down a lot. I think that shows how aggressive your team is. And they can convert reliably with the run game or the passing game on those fourth downs. Indiana can. They're very good at picking up short yardage through the ground. They've had some struggles as well. They're not perfect, but that's just like Ohio State's rushing offense. Ohio State has the better running backs, but their offensive line has been shaky, especially since that Josh Simmons injury, which is very sad. In response to that, Ohio State shifted on the offensive line. They've moved Donovan Jackson to left tackle. Carson Hinsman's been inserted at left guard, and they've done well. They've rebounded. But against Northwestern, they allowed interior penetration. Against Penn State, they allowed that at times. Against Oregon, even before Simmons got hurt, they allowed interior penetration. They have issues in pass blocking and in run blocking that I think their running backs do a very good job at compensating for because they are alien-like players. So this is the critical matchup right here in the trenches. The offensive lines and the defensive lines and the linebackers sticking to their gap assignments when blitzing or when figuring out whether it's a run play, staying disciplined in play action, etc. The trenches. That is what is going to be the biggest determining factor in this game as to whether Indiana covers, Ohio State covers, whether Indiana wins, or Ohio State wins, or it's a close game that can go back and forth. The trenches really determine that here. Breaking down these two offenses, I think that Indiana is better at tight end and also offensive tackle. I think Ohio State's better at running back, wide receiver. I think that Seth McLaughlin's one of the best centers in the country, and Mike Caddick has been very good at center as well, but I would give McLaughlin the edge there. At quarterback's a push. I don't know who I'd lean toward. I think that Will Howard has the higher ceiling, but also has a bigger capacity to make dumb, idiotic mistakes. Curtis Rourke doesn't have the same ceiling, in part because he's not as mobile, but he's also only thrown 4 interceptions on the year. Howard has thrown 5. Ohio State has fumbled the ball a lot this season, and part of that is obviously on their running backs. Some of it is on the quarterback, though. I mean, Ohio State averages 1.2 fumbles per game. That's 66th. But they only lose 0.3 of those fumbles per game. So out of all the times they fumble, they only lose 25% of their fumbles, which some of that is luck, if we're being honest right there. And luck is something that we don't talk about a lot because it's not, honestly, it's kind of a lame way to excuse things away. Like if either of these teams win this game, it's probably not due to luck, and even if it is, they still earned it. But in a game like this where it can be very close, it's something interesting to note where if Ohio State fumbles at their typical rate, but Indiana recovers all the attempts that they fumble, if they recover 100% of Ohio State's fumbles, that could change the game. That could take a possession away from Ohio State where maybe they score a touchdown if they recover the fumble or if they don't fumble at all, and Indiana could score on that fumble recovery. So it's just something interesting to take note of. And also, I would say guard is an area that's a push. I would give Indiana guard, if not for an injury that they sustained a few weeks ago on the offensive line, where I believe his name is James Evans at guard. He's out for the year with an Achilles injury, which just sucks. Be praying for him. It's the same thing with Josh Simmons, but it's not James Evans, it's Drew Evans. Drew Evans was their highest rated guard, and he's out. He's been replaced by Tyler Steffens, who hasn't been as good. It's a similar story, actually, to Michalski replacing Simmons, and even a little bit of Jackson replacing Simmons as well at left tackle, where he's done better than Michalski is. Donovan Jackson has, but still not to that same level. Caddick, again, has been phenomenal this year. You look at the tackles for Indiana, Trey Wedig and Carter Smith have been absolutely amazing. I imagine that Indiana with a bye too will do better on offense, kind of working in Steffens more, getting him in more reps in the same way that Ohio State, as the season's gone on without Simmons, they've done a better job negating what used to be a gaping hole because they've adjusted to life without him. You look at these wide receivers, Keshawn Williams, Omar Cooper Jr., Miles Price, Elijah Surratt, Miles Cross. They have been great this year. Indiana on the season, 2,765 passing yards, 70% of their passes are complete, 25 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, a 179.8 passer rating. They average 9.9 yards per attempt and 14.2 yards per completion. Rourke is an 88.1 passer rating, and they have 1,767 rushing yards for 4.7 yards per carry and 32 rushing touchdowns. You look at Ohio State, 2,676 passing yards, 9.4 yards per attempt, 70.5% of their passes are completed, 26 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, a 176 passer rating. Will Howard on the year, he has a 85.3 QBR, which is fourth, barely behind Rourke. They have 1,838 rushing yards for 5.3 yards per carry and 22 rushing touchdowns, and they average 13.3 yards per completion. So these offenses are very similar. Again, Indiana, I'd take it tight end and tackle, running back, wide receiver, and center go to Ohio State. And quarterback and guard, I think, is a bit of a push. If I had to go one way or the other, I would lean, honestly, Ohio State at QB and Indiana at guard if I had to lean one way or the other on those. But let's just leave them at a push for now. Defensively, I would take Indiana at defensive end and corner. I would take Ohio State at defensive tackle and easily safety, though. And linebacker is a push. If I had to lean one way at linebacker, it would probably be the Ohio State Buckeyes. You look at both of these teams and the players and the snap counts and everything that they have. I think that Indiana has quality depth on the defensive line. And Michael Kamara this year almost has 10 sacks on the season. He is a non-negotiable. 9.5 sacks on the year, 2 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, a pass defended. James Carpenter, 4 sacks. Tyreek Tucker, 2.5. CJ West has 2. They each have a pass defended, and CJ West has a forced fumble. The defensive line for Indiana is deep. They can rotate. They can all contribute. Ohio State's defensive line has a lot of NFL players on it. Second rounders, maybe some first rounders, depending on how they finish out the year. Third rounders, really in that upper half of the NFL draft round category. But in terms of depth, I don't know exactly what they have because they haven't been rotating a ton there. And I think what they've done to help compensate for some things in the defensive line that they don't like is they've been blitzing a lot more. And Cody Simon has been very effective. He's been one of the nation's best linebackers this year. Sonny Styles has performed at a high level. And same with Mitchell Melton, Arvell Reese. I mean, they have depth at linebacker that I questioned in the preseason. Ohio State does. And I like what they have there on the front. Same with JT Tuimoloau, with Jack Sawyer, with Tyleik Williams, Ty Hamilton. Both of these defensive fronts are very good. They're full of veteran players, and they perform at a high level. And then you look at the defensive backfield, D'Angelo Pons, Sean Asbury for Indiana, and then you have, just a little bit of a brain fart there. Denzel Burke, Jordan Hancock, Caleb Downs, Lathan Ransom, and then Davison Igbinosun, who's been the most penalized corner in all of college football. He sometimes makes up for it with a big play, but that's really where Ohio State receives most of their penalties is Davison Igbinosun holds or pass interference calls, because Ohio State this year is 9th in penalties per game, committing only 4.3. They only average 41.3 penalty yards per game, and they only give up 0.8 penalty first downs per game. They're one of the more disciplined teams in college football, too. Indiana is 27th in penalties per game, only averaging 5.2. They only average 48.9 penalty yards per game, which is 51st, and they only give up 1.8 penalty first downs per game, which is 69th. So they're worse than Ohio State in penalties, but not drastically worse. Indiana is still a very disciplined football team, and I think that both of these defenses they're underrated. And we'll talk about this more when I do my deep dive later this week, and I'll bring out all the statistics possible, and I'll just go over that and spend like 30 or 40 minutes talking about the statistics and the deep dive from that angle. But these two teams, they have good defenses too, just like they have good offenses. I think both have elite offenses. Indiana's defense is a little bit of an unknown because early in the year they struggled, but recently against Nebraska, Michigan State, Michigan, really Washington, although none of those offenses are anything amazing, they've been playing at a very high level and at an amazing level, even factoring in the poor offenses they've played over the past month, the past 4 games to be exact. Ohio State on defense is the best in the nation per most analytics, and it's certainly top 10. I think Indiana's is top 10 as well. Analytics wouldn't go that far, but I think they're trending in the right direction. When you look at the trenches, I would actually give a slight lean to Indiana because they're better at tackle, they're better at end, they are about the same at guard, and I would lean toward them at guard. And defensive tackle, while I gave that to OSU, it's pretty competitive there. It's very, very competitive. Center, I would go with Ohio State. Watching these two teams, and I'm going to watch more film, and I may even change my prediction because I'll give you a little bit of a hint here. I'm not confident in picking who's going to win. I'm not confident in my pick at all for a variety of reasons that I think we've already discussed here. These are two really good teams who are well coached, and they're fundamentally sound and disciplined, and they're aggressive, and they can run different formations on offense and defense. I would lean IU in the trenches, but if you wanted to tell me OSU is better, you can, and I will listen to that because there's a good chance at that. If you wanted to tell me they are dead even, I will listen to you there as well. What makes judging Ohio State's trench play so tough is the fact that their skill position players are so good that there's a chance they totally negate trench play that just is not national title caliber. Because they have Jeremiah Smith, because they have 2 elite running backs, because they have Emeka Egbuka, and a quarterback who's been very productive and who's actually been pressured quite a bit in November and October, but because of his veterancy and his pocket awareness, he's avoided a lot of that pressure and made plays off of it. There's a good chance that Ohio State is so good at the skill positions that against a team that can't put pressure on their defense, you will never see weakness on the O-line or even the D-line because, they're just that good at scoring points and making plays on offense thanks to their skill position players like Jeremiah Smith. Indiana doesn't have that. They don't have those generational aliens at wide receiver or running back or quarterback. A lot of it's schemed out, and I think because of that, it's easier to judge Indiana's trench play, and that's why I'm leaning toward them. I also lean Indiana in terms of special teams, but per ESPN special teams efficiency, Ohio State special teams have been trending up, IU's has been trending down. So if you want to argue to me that Ohio State's been getting better on special teams, Indiana's been getting a little bit worse, so you're going to lean Ohio State, I won't argue against that at all. Again, these teams are very, very evenly matched. I would say the greatest disparity between these two teams is running back talent, wide receiver talent in favor of Ohio State. I would say defensive line production in favor of Indiana. Ohio State's defensive line is very talented, but Indiana gets a lot more production from what they have out of their defensive line than Ohio State does. And I would also say quarterback. Oh no, tight end in favor of Indiana. And not quarterback, cornerback. Cornerback production out of Indiana compared to Ohio State, because Denzel Burke and Igbinosun have committed these penalties and have gotten burned against most of the wide receiver corps they've played. Whether it's Northwestern, where Bryce Kurtz was matching up well and burning Burke, or whether it was against Iowa and Igbinosun was getting up like holding calls and pass interference calls, or he did the same thing against Nebraska before he finally got an interception against Iowa. So there are some things that go each way, but overall these two teams are very evenly matched. I would take Indiana at strength and conditioning. I would take Ohio State's defensive staff over Indiana's right now. Head coach is a push, not because of overall resume. Obviously, Ryan Day leads Curt Cignetti there. It's more so game management. When I talk about head coaching rankings in the Coaching Edge segment, it's game management. That's what we're talking about. And I think that both Ryan Day and Curt Cignetti have overall done a very good job at managing their teams this year and putting them in positions to win. They've had some faults, like Indiana not taking all the clock down when they were driving late against Michigan to try and close out a game in which they kind of let Michigan through the back door. That was not a good decision. It also wasn't a good decision for Ryan Day to call the game that he did late against Oregon, in my opinion, especially seeing that Jaden Fielding indeed can make field goals from that 40-yard range. But they've overall done a very good job. I mean, the Penn State game for OSU, I think, says that. I think the Nebraska game late for Ohio State actually says that a bit, even with their struggles there. And for Indiana, that Nebraska game, that was the epitome of I own you from a coaching perspective from Curt Cignetti to Matt Rule. And offensively, I also think there's a push. Chip Kelly has had some games where it's pretty up and it's also pretty down. Indiana has been more consistent. There haven't been the same, quote, Einstein moments from Indiana's offensive staff, in my opinion, but maybe I need to watch more film, and I'm going to do even more film watching when I make my deep dive. You want to click the notification bell so you can watch that, by the way. As for, how do I put this? As for the lows, though, for Indiana, I have not seen games where Indiana's offense has been totally limited by schematic choice. We saw that against Nebraska, where Ohio State was having some success through the air, and they schematically chose to be stubborn and run the football, and it almost cost them the game. We saw that at times, I would say, against Oregon, and some of it was a necessity where, they had to abandon the run, but also it made it easier for Oregon to game plan on defense and come up with that late stop because, well, that late stop they had to pass, but I'm talking about at different points in the game where if Ohio State finds a way to run the football better or they're more creative in their rushing concepts, like what they did against Penn State. What they did against Penn State was very good. That was one of the best game plans I've seen from Ohio State all season long. The Oregon game plan, it was effective, but I don't think it was as good. The Nebraska one was a disaster. I have not seen Indiana have a disastrous game plan on offense, but I have not seen them have just an absolute surgical attack on offense either, with maybe the exception of the Nebraska game, but I actually think Indiana just straight up out-talented Nebraska for much of that game on top of good preparation. I finally have gotten to it, and I just took a lot of time because this is a big game, and I want to talk about it a lot. Indiana is a 13.5 point underdog. Bless me. 13.5 point underdog to Ohio State. And I reiterate that because that's a pretty big number for teams that are very, very, very similar. This is not Georgia versus TCU. This is not Michigan versus Washington. The schematics and, more importantly, the body of work that the statistics have provided, that these teams have provided through 10 games, does not indicate that there is a serious matchup disadvantage for Indiana here, like the spread indicates. As college football nerds said, I don't think that this is a number that is begging you to take Indiana. I just think that the power ratings straight up believe Ohio State's double-digit favorites, and that's understandable. I mean, you look at FPI or S&P Plus, Ohio State's projected to win this game by anywhere from like 10 to 13 points. Those are power ratings. There's no baiting people to take Indiana here, I don't think, in the same way that people were taking Tennessee against Georgia, and I fell for that even though my model told me to pick Georgia. My model was correct. But here, I just think that whether it's because of the talent disparity that's baked into most power ratings, which is wise on a multitude of fronts, but sometimes is, well, not a good thing, can lead to inaccuracies at times, and because of the fact that Ohio State has played tougher competition, which allows them to move up higher at a faster rate in power ratings, I do think here that Indiana's a bit undervalued. I mean, they are, let me read you this briefly before we get off here. Indiana, this year, they score 0.605 points per play. That's first. They have a points per play margin, again, 0.374. That's fourth. They score 40.2 points per game. It's even higher if you include the game against the FCS competition. They score 5.2 offensive touchdowns per game. Ohio State scores 4.9. Indiana, their red zone conversion percentage is 97.92%. Ohio State's is 97.06%. You look at scoring defense. Indiana allows 15 points per game, 8th. Ohio State 10.7, 1st. Indiana 0.231 opponent points per play, 8th. Ohio State 0.176. Indiana forces opponents to gain 18 yards to score a single point, 11th. Ohio State forces opponents to gain 23.6 yards to score a single point, that's 3rd. And finally, total defense, Indiana only allows their opponents to average 4.2 yards per play. Ohio State forces opponents to average 4.1 yards per play. This is not TCU versus Georgia. This is not Washington versus Michigan. There is no serious mismatch here between Ohio State and Indiana. Unless you think that strength of schedule is so important and that Indiana is such a soft team and so overrated that when they walk into Ohio Stadium and when they face off against Ohio State, because Ohio State simply has 5 stars, therefore Indiana will crumble, which I think is a pretty disingenuous argument. My potential power index picks Ohio State to win this game by 8.5, and I think that Indiana covers. I agree with my power ratings there, and I also agree that Ohio State wins. I need to watch more film. I need to digest these teams more and look at them more, and I need to see Indiana either put together a genius game plan or totally dominate in the trenches through multiple games, just complete, absolute domination, and see maybe an alien level play or two before I can pick the Hoosiers. And believe me, I'm not confident. I can see Indiana winning this game. I can see Indiana winning by double digits. I can see Ohio State winning this game and winning by double digits. I may change my pick when I do the deep dive in a day or two, and anywhere from 24 to 48 hours from now when I release that video. I may change my prediction. And honestly, you may expect me. You maybe should expect me to change it. But that's all I have in today's video. I'm picking Ohio State to win and Indiana to cover. Ohio State wins 31-27. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Connor OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, Will Loftus for being All-Conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, everyone. Go Buckeyes and go Hoosiers.